December 15, 1943. At 11,000 feet above sea level in the Italian Alps, the morning air hung crystalline and deadly still. Sergeant Erik Holmberg of the Norwegian Mountain Corps pressed his weathered face against the frost-covered rocks, studying the German encampment sprawled across the valley floor below like scattered toy soldiers. The occupying forces believed their mountain fortress was impregnable, confident that winter itself was their greatest ally. They could not have been more mistaken. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these seasoned alpine troops were about to witness would shatter everything they thought they knew about mountain warfare, proving that sometimes the smallest actions can unleash the most devastating consequences in nature's unforgiving theater. Erik had spent 37 years reading the mountains like other men read newspapers. Born in a tiny village above the Arctic Circle, he had learned to speak the language of snow before he could properly speak Norwegian. His grandfather, Niels Holmberg, had been a legendary mountain guide who once saved an entire expedition by predicting an avalanche 3 days before it occurred. That same intuitive understanding of snow dynamics now coursed through Erik's veins as he observed the German position with the calculating eye of a natural predator. The German Alpine Corps had established what they considered an unassailable winter position in the Dolomites. Colonel Friedrich Weber, commanding the 2,047 men of the 99th Mountain Division, had personally selected this location for its strategic advantages. The valley provided excellent observation points, natural shelter from the bitter alpine winds, and what appeared to be complete protection from avalanche danger due to the gentle slope of the surrounding ridges. Weber's meteorological advisor, Lieutenant Hans Krieger, had assured him that the snow conditions posed minimal threat to their encampment. Weber was a methodical man who believed in the supremacy of German engineering and tactical doctrine. His forces had spent 6 weeks fortifying their position with impressive efficiency. They had constructed reinforced bunkers, established supply lines, and created what they considered an impregnable mountain stronghold. The colonel often stood at his command post, surveying the pristine alpine landscape with satisfaction, convinced that Allied forces could never dislodge them from this winter sanctuary. What Weber and his meteorological expert failed to understand was that the Dolomites operated according to laws far older and more powerful than military strategy. The snow that blanketed their position was not merely frozen water, but a complex, living system of layers and tensions that could transform from protective blanket to devastating weapon in the span of seconds. Erik had been observing the German position for 8 days, not through binoculars, but through the subtle signs that only a true mountain man could interpret. He watched how the wind patterns shifted around the peaks, noted the way morning frost formed on different rock faces, and most critically, observed the gradual accumulation of what mountaineers call depth hoar, the unstable, crystalline snow layer that forms when temperature gradients create internal stress within the snowpack. From his concealed observation post, Erik could see that the Germans had unknowingly positioned themselves in what his grandfather would have called a snow trap. The natural geography of the valley created a perfect avalanche chute, with multiple slopes converging toward the German encampment like the fingers of a gigantic hand. More dangerous still, recent weather patterns had created a textbook example of unstable snow layering. 3 weeks earlier, a warm Chinook wind had created a thin crust layer in the snowpack. Subsequent snowfall had buried this crust under several feet of newer snow, creating what avalanche experts term a classic weak layer interface. The newer snow above this layer was growing heavier each day, while the buried crust remained brittle and prone to sudden failure. Erik could practically feel the mountain holding its breath, waiting for the right trigger to release its accumulated energy. On the morning of December 15th, Erik made his final observations and calculations. The temperature had dropped to -22 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, followed by a slight warming trend that would begin around noon. This temperature pattern would create the perfect conditions for what he had planned. The slight warming would increase the stress on the already unstable snow layer, while the morning cold would keep the surface layer temporarily stable. Erik carried with him a collection of what appeared to be ordinary mountain stones, each one carefully selected from a high alpine moraine field. These were not random rocks, but precisely chosen projectiles, each weighing approximately 2 pounds and shaped by thousands of years of glacial action into aerodynamic perfection. More importantly, he had spent hours calculating the exact trajectory needed to reach a specific point on the slope above the German position. The target was not the German encampment itself, but a seemingly insignificant snow cornice approximately 800 feet above their position. Eric had identified this cornice as the critical failure point in the entire slope system. Like a keystone in an ancient arch, this single formation was supporting the stability of thousands of tons of accumulated snow across multiple ridges and slopes. At exactly 11:45 a.m., Eric began his ascent to the throwing position he had selected on a rocky outcrop 700 feet above the target cornice. The climb required absolute silence and precision, as any disturbance could potentially trigger the very avalanche he sought to control. Each footstep was placed with the care of a surgeon, each handheld tested for stability before committing his full weight. The physical demands of the climb at such altitude were enormous. Eric's lungs burned with each breath of the thin mountain air, and his hands grew numb despite his specially designed Norwegian military gloves. But these hardships were insignificant compared to the mental calculations required to execute his plan. He had to account for wind speed and direction, air density at altitude, the trajectory arc of his projectile, and most critically, the exact timing needed to create maximum destabilization of the target area. Below in the German encampment, the daily routine continued with typical Alpine Corps efficiency. Weber was conducting his noon briefing with his senior staff, discussing supply logistics and patrol schedules. Lieutenant Krieger was updating weather observations, noting the slight temperature increase, but seeing no cause for concern. The enlisted men were preparing their midday meal, grateful for the relative warmth of their sheltered position. Private Johann Müller, a 19-year-old from Bavaria, was writing a letter to his sister back home, describing the beauty of the Italian mountains and assuring her that his unit was safely positioned for the winter. Corporal Klaus Richter was maintaining his equipment, methodically cleaning his rifle and checking his winter gear with the thoroughness that had kept him alive through 2 years of mountain warfare. None of these experienced Alpine troops suspected that their fate was about to be determined by a single Norwegian soldier and a carefully thrown stone 800 feet above their heads. Eric reached his throwing position at 12:07 p.m., precisely 3 minutes ahead of his planned schedule. The rocky outcrop provided perfect stability and an unobstructed trajectory to his target. From this vantage point, he could see the entire German position spread below him like a detailed military map. The encampment covered approximately 2 square kilometers, with the main command bunkers positioned near the center of what would soon become the Avalanche impact zone. The meteorological conditions were approaching perfect alignment for his plan. A light wind from the southwest was beginning to blow, which would provide additional force to his projectile, while simultaneously adding stress to the already unstable snow cornice. The temperature had risen to -18 degrees, exactly within the range Eric had calculated as optimal for triggering the avalanche mechanism. Eric selected his first stone from the carefully curated collection he had carried up the mountain. This particular rock was smooth granite, worn to aerodynamic perfection by centuries of glacial movement. It fit perfectly in his throwing hand and possessed the exact weight distribution needed for accurate long-distance trajectory. He had practiced this throw hundreds of times using similar stones and identical distances during his training with the Norwegian Mountain Corps. At 12:15 p.m., Eric drew back his arm and launched the projectile with the full force of his considerable strength and expertise. The stone arced through the crystalline mountain air, following a perfect parabolic trajectory toward the target cornice. For several seconds, the only sounds were the whistle of wind through the peaks and the distant murmur of voices from the German encampment below. The stone struck the snow cornice with what seemed like insignificant impact, creating a small puff of snow dust that dispersed immediately in the mountain breeze. For nearly 30 seconds, nothing appeared to happen. The cornice remained intact, the slope showed no signs of instability, and the German soldiers below continued their daily routines completely unaware of what had just occurred. Then Eric heard the sound he had been waiting for, a subtle crack that seemed to emanate from deep within the mountain itself. The initial failure was invisible from his position, occurring within the buried weak layer that connected the struck cornice to the broader slope system. This underground fracture began propagating horizontally across the mountainside at approximately 200 miles per hour, following the interface between the old crust layer and the newer snow above it. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of natural forces unleashed. The initial fracture triggered a cascade failure across multiple slope sections, each failure adding exponential energy to the developing avalanche. Within 45 seconds of Eric's stone impact, over 50,000 tons of snow were in motion, accelerating down the mountainside toward the German position with unstoppable momentum. The avalanche began as a relatively narrow slide originating from the struck cornice, but the unique geography of the Dolomites transformed it into something far more devastating. As the initial snow mass descended, it triggered sympathetic failures on adjacent slopes, creating a converging pattern of multiple avalanche paths that focused their combined energy directly onto the German encampment. Colonel Weber was the first to recognize the approaching disaster. His experienced mountain warfare training allowed him to identify the distinctive rumbling sound of a major avalanche even before the snow mass became visible through the trees. He immediately began shouting orders for emergency evacuation procedures, but the speed of the developing catastrophe left virtually no time for effective response. The sound grew from a distant rumble to an overwhelming roar that drowned out all human voices and filled the valley with acoustic energy. Trees that had stood for centuries were snapped like matchsticks and swept along with the advancing wall of snow and debris. The avalanche was now moving at over 80 miles per hour and contained an estimated 120,000 tons of snow, ice, rocks, and organic debris. Lieutenant Krieger, the meteorological advisor who had assured Weber of the safety of their position, stared in absolute shock at the approaching white wall. His scientific training had focused on weather prediction and snow measurement, but nothing in his education had prepared him for witnessing the awesome power of an alpine avalanche in full development. In those final seconds before impact, he realized that his fundamental understanding of mountain snow dynamics had been tragically incomplete. Private Mueller dropped his letter home and began running toward higher ground, his 19-year-old legs carrying him with desperate speed across the frozen valley floor. Behind him, he could hear his fellow soldiers shouting orders and warnings, but individual voices were already becoming lost in the overwhelming acoustic signature of the approaching snowslide. He managed to climb approximately 50 feet up the valley's eastern slope before the avalanche engulfed his position. The impact, when it finally came, exceeded even Eric's expectations for devastating effectiveness. The converging avalanche paths created a compression effect that actually amplified the destructive force beyond what any single slope failure could have generated. The German encampment simply vanished beneath a moving mountain of snow that was 30 feet deep in some areas, and traveling with sufficient momentum to continue several hundred yards beyond the valley floor. From his observation position, Eric watched the entire German position disappear in less than 2 minutes. Where moments before there had been bunkers, equipment, vehicles, and 2,000 German soldiers, there was now only an undulating field of white snow that stretched across the valley like a freshly smoothed bedsheet. The silence that followed the avalanche was profound and unsettling, broken only by the settling sounds of the enormous snow mass as it found its final resting configuration. The avalanche had achieved what would have required weeks of conventional military assault to accomplish. An entire German Alpine division had been neutralized through the application of superior mountain knowledge and a single well-placed stone. But Eric felt no satisfaction at the devastating effectiveness of his action. He had spent enough time in the mountains to understand that avalanches made no distinction between friend and enemy. They simply followed the immutable laws of physics and gravity. Eric remained in his observation position for another hour, watching for any signs of survivor activity below. Occasionally, he could detect small movements in the snowfield, where individuals might be attempting to dig themselves out, but the depth and density of the avalanche debris made successful self-rescue virtually impossible. The temperature was dropping again as afternoon shadows began creeping across the valley. which would soon freeze the snowmass into concrete hard consistency. That evening, Eric made his way down to a predetermined rendezvous point where he met with Allied intelligence officers to report the success of his mission. Captain James Morrison of the British Special Operations Executive and Major Roberto Castelli of the Italian Resistance had been monitoring the German position through remote observation posts and confirmed the complete elimination of the enemy force. Morrison's initial reaction was one of professional admiration, mixed with genuine shock at the scope of destruction that had been achieved through such seemingly minimal action. As an experienced special operations officer, he had witnessed the effectiveness of sabotage and guerrilla tactics, but nothing had prepared him for seeing an entire military division neutralized by a single thrown stone and superior knowledge of natural forces. Major Castelli, who had grown up in the Italian Alps and considered himself knowledgeable about mountain conditions, was particularly impressed by Eric's ability to predict and trigger such a precisely targeted avalanche. The Italian officer had seen many natural avalanches during his lifetime, but witnessing one deliberately created through human intervention gave him a new appreciation for the deadly potential that existed within seemingly peaceful mountain environments. The official military reports of the incident would later describe it as a natural disaster that befell German forces due to poor position selection and inadequate understanding of alpine hazards. This classification served multiple strategic purposes, allowing Allied forces to avoid revealing their capability to weaponize natural mountain forces, while simultaneously discouraging other German units from establishing similar winter positions in avalanche-prone terrain. Eric himself provided extensive debriefings to Allied mountain warfare specialists, sharing his techniques for reading snow conditions and identifying potential avalanche trigger points. His knowledge became the foundation for training programs that would later be used by special forces operating in mountain environments around the world. However, the specific details of his stone-throwing technique and target selection methodology remained classified for decades following the conclusion of the conflict. In the months that followed, rescue teams would eventually recover approximately 400 bodies from the avalanche site, but the majority of the German Alpine Corps remained permanently entombed beneath the hardened snow mass. The site became a sobering reminder of both the power of natural forces and the importance of respecting mountain environments that operated according to laws far older than human conflict. Colonel Weber's body was found in spring of 1944, still seated at his command desk with weather reports scattered around him. Lieutenant Krieger was discovered near a meteorological instrument station, apparently having attempted to take final measurements even as the avalanche approached. Private Möller was never found, presumably still buried somewhere beneath tons of snow and debris that would not fully melt for several years. Eric returned to Norway after the conclusion of the European conflict, where he resumed his peaceful life as a mountain guide and avalanche safety instructor. He rarely spoke about his wartime activities, preferring to focus his expertise on preventing avalanche accidents rather than causing them. His post-war writings on mountain safety and snow science became standard references for alpine rescue organizations throughout Europe. The Dolomites Valley, where the avalanche occurred, remained virtually uninhabitable for 3 years following the incident. The enormous mass of debris-filled snow created a temporary lake during spring melt seasons, fundamentally altering the local hydrology and ecology. When the area was finally cleared and made safe for human habitation, it was developed as a memorial site dedicated to all victims of mountain warfare, regardless of their nationality or military affiliation. Modern avalanche scientists who have studied Eric's technique describe it as a nearly perfect example of understanding snow mechanics and natural trigger points. The precision required to identify the exact failure point in such a complex slope system, combined with the accuracy needed to deliver the triggering force to the precise location, represents a level of mountain expertise that few individuals have ever achieved. The incident also led to fundamental changes in military doctrine regarding winter positioning in mountain environments. Both Allied and German forces developed new protocols for avalanche hazard assessment, and mountain warfare training programs began incorporating extensive education about natural disaster risks. The lesson learned was that in mountain environments, knowledge of natural forces could be far more valuable than conventional military hardware. Weather records from December 1943 show that the snow conditions on that day were indeed perfect for avalanche initiation, with temperature gradients and layer interfaces creating maximum instability throughout the alpine region. Several other smaller avalanches occurred naturally in the Dolomites during the same period, but none approached the scale and devastating impact of the deliberately triggered slide that eliminated the German Alpine Corps position. Erik's story became legendary within Norwegian mountain rescue circles, though the full details remained classified until the 1980s. When his techniques were finally declassified and made available to civilian avalanche professionals, they contributed significantly to modern understanding of how small disturbances can trigger massive slope failures in unstable snow conditions. The philosophical implications of the incident continued to fascinate military historians and natural scientists for decades afterward. The demonstration that a single individual with superior knowledge could neutralize a large conventional force through understanding and application of natural laws represented a fundamental shift in thinking about the relationship between human conflict and environmental factors. In his later years, Erik often reflected on the moral complexity of his wartime actions. While he understood the military necessity of eliminating the German position, he remained sobered by the awesome destructive power he had unleashed through such seemingly simple means. His post-war dedication to avalanche safety and mountain rescue work served as a form of personal redemption, using his expertise to save lives rather than take them. The stone that Erik threw that December morning was never recovered, presumably buried somewhere deep beneath the avalanche debris, along with the German soldiers it had helped to defeat. But the knowledge and techniques that made such precision possible continued to influence mountain warfare doctrine, avalanche science, and special operations training for generations of soldiers and scientists who came after. Today, the valley in the Italian Dolomites, where 2,000 German soldiers met their fate, is a peaceful alpine meadow popular with hikers and nature enthusiasts. A small memorial plaque written in Italian, German, and English commemorates all those who lost their lives in mountain warfare during the Second World War. Few visitors realize they are standing above one of the most devastating avalanche sites in military history, triggered by a Norwegian mountain man and a carefully thrown stone. The technique that Erik employed that December day represents the perfect convergence of traditional mountain knowledge, scientific understanding, and military necessity. His ability to read the subtle signs of snow instability, combined with the precision required to deliver exactly the right amount of force to the correct trigger point, created a moment where human intelligence successfully harnessed natural forces for strategic military advantage. Mountain warfare specialists continue to study Erik's methods as an example of how deep environmental knowledge can provide overwhelming tactical advantages over conventional military approaches. The incident demonstrates that in certain circumstances, understanding natural systems can be far more powerful than superior numbers, better equipment, or advanced technology. The avalanche of December 15, 1943, stands as a testament to both the devastating power of natural forces and the extraordinary knowledge required to predict and control them. Erik Holmberg's expertise transformed him from a single Norwegian soldier into a force of nature himself, capable of moving mountains and changing the course of military history with nothing more than a well-placed stone and an intimate understanding of how snow, gravity, and geology interact in the high alpine environment. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.